Welcome everyone. This is Fundamentals of Diversity and Inclusion for Technologists. My name is Reza Rahman. In my day job, I am Principal Program Manager for Java on Azure. But today's talk is really nothing to do with my day job. In fact, it has much more fundamental significance to me, more or less as an individual. I'm very, very grateful for FOSDEM to have had this talk, and of course my friend Girjan for accepting this talk. This talk, I think, is very, very important and perhaps very, very critical in a particular segment of time for all of us as a society. So without further ado, let me get the talk started. I think first and foremost, it is important for you to understand why as an individual, I am doing this talk. And perhaps by doing that, I can make this particular sensitive topic a bit less impersonal and perhaps help you contextualize some of this in the perspective of a particular individual, particularly being me. So who am I? At the end of the day, I have several parts of my identity that are important to me. I'm an immigrant, I'm a Muslim, I am a person of color, I am by and large, I would say, a nonconformist, and I'm also an idealist. I deal more with issues of what should be rather than what necessarily is. And the sad reality is that those particular parts of my identity have had an impact and have placed burdens on my journey as an individual that really should have never been. And in fact, in course of doing this talk, I am breaking sort of an implicit taboo. And that taboo particularly applies to people that are in so-called model minorities. And in fact, I'm probably only in part of that model minority. That we don't talk about when we reach a particular point in our career, that we no longer talk about the journey that got us there, and particularly the ugly parts of that journey that got us there. So this particular slide is to give you a snapshot of the kind of obstacles that I have had to deal with and overcome in my lifetime. And that is a span of some decades now, and now that I am standing in front of you to do this particular talk. So as part of this journey, part of the question that I am now faced with is, what is my responsibility? Having lived through this lived experience and having had to deal with and overcome some of these obstacles. And in reality, I'm not very hopeful that things will change for me very much. In fact, frankly speaking, I'm almost at the end of my journey anyway. And a lot of these things are such fundamental things and things that will take such a long time to address that I think there's very little hope that things will change for me in particular, at least in whatever the remainder of my career happens to be. But what I'm hoping to do by taking advantage of this particular window of opportunity in our society is begin to enact some changes that hopefully will help not me, but hopefully somebody a lot like me down the road, that is not at the end of their journey, but hopefully maybe towards the beginning of their journey. And hopefully I can do those changes with some help from you. In fact, if you are attending this talk and listening to this talk of your own choice, maybe you are already doing that. And you can be part of what causes these particular dynamics that I've had to face over time to no longer be factors going forward. So this is obviously a problem far beyond just me, right? There is no underestimating the impact of these problems when you take a look at the numbers. The numbers are very, very stark, and I won't go into great details of it, but in reality, in the context of the United States, pretty much this affects almost more than half of the segment of the population, in fact, more than half. And that is counting people that are Hispanic, Black, Asian, women, people of color, people of different sexual orientations, and so on. And we'll talk about some of those characteristics in a moment. So this is not a narrow problem at all. This is a huge problem that impacts a very, very large percent of the population. In fact, if you really look at it, the only people that don't seem to be able to successfully overcome some of these obstacles seem to be Asians. But even that, frankly, is somewhat of an illusion. If you look at one step beyond these numbers, while Asians have representation in the technology industries slightly better than some of the other marginalized groups, when you begin to take a look at leadership positions, even there, Asians are no exception. Even there, Asians are lagging behind where even their representation should be. And that representation in the United States is actually rather small, as you can see, maybe about 5% of the population, and to be even very generous. So that representation isn't even there when you look at people in leadership positions. So this is a very, very large problem. And let's assume for a moment that you are not part of any of those marginalized groups. Maybe you should maybe you're asking yourself, okay, why should I care about these things? You know, this is somebody else's problem. I don't have to encounter these problems. In fact, I'm probably the beneficiary of some of these dynamics. But the reality is there is many good reasons why you should care. And in fact, if these are problems that could just be solved by marginalized people themselves, then maybe there wouldn't have been a reason to have this conversation whatsoever. So in fact, you are part and parcel of the conversation, and you should care about these things. And there's many reasons why, but I'll list 4 of these fundamental reasons, if you will. So one is diverse perspectives. By not having these perspectives into our products and into our companies and into the things that we are building, basically we miss out on important features, important parts of problems that we ought to be solving. Similarly, the flip side of that is by doing that, we're actually narrowing the reach of where our problem set should be and what are all of the benefits, all of the work that we are all doing. You know, does that work really benefit everyone? It doesn't, right? If it doesn't, if in the input process that perspective is not there in the first place, it's highly unlikely that the output is reflective of that broader band of problems and impact that we should be having. Similarly, in terms of if you look at it from a business owner or productivity standpoint, what it also means is by not having adequate representation of large segments of the population, ultimately you wind up with untapped potential, right? There could be many more talented people that bring their expertise and skills to the table that is just not happening because of these barriers. And there's no other way to explain these differences. If you go back and look at the numbers are just so stark. There's no rational explanation of any of those other than the fact that, just like me, people face obstacles, and unlike me, in many cases, they may not be able to overcome those obstacles to get to a certain point in their career or to have a certain impact. Similarly, another very important key aspect to understand, and one of the reasons why some of these dynamics are so long-lasting, is in fact this is not a zero-sum game. At the end of it, it does not need to be that somebody, in order for someone to benefit, somebody else needs to lose out. The reality, in fact, is that if we are all full participants and we are all bringing our best selves and we are all living up to our full potential, in fact, that maximizes prosperity for everyone. And this is not just a hypothetical question or hypothetical observation either. If you look at an honest look at history, what you'll see is there's many examples of societies that have embraced diversity, embraced the new, embraced the different, and by doing that have added to their prosperity in their own ways. Whether that's ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia or Rome or perhaps the Indus Valley civilizations, they have all been able to reconcile those things and be able to maximize their prosperity by embracing what is different and what is new and what is diverse. In fact, you could argue to some extent this is true of the Western world today as well. Perhaps not to the point where it should be, and hopefully we can all improve that situation. But this is probably true of the Western world as well, is that the West benefits from having at least diversity, maybe not quite inclusion yet. And we'll talk about the distinction between diversity and inclusion in a moment as well. And most importantly, for me at least, is that if you are a person of conscience, whether that is because of religious reasons or whether you are simply somebody that thinks of themselves as a person of conscience, this is simply wrong. Right? It should not be the case. It's a fundamental human right issue that people, just because of who they are, just because of their identity, deal with obstacles that they should not be dealing with. So this is obviously a very broad issue. Within the span of the half hour that I have to deliver this talk to you today, I will not be able to give you a holistic framework to solve all of these problems. But here's what I can hope to do. What I can hope to do is begin to start you on a journey. In fact, again, if you are attending this talk of your own choice, you probably have started that journey already. So what I'm going to aim to do in the next 20 minutes is something pretty modest, but nonetheless important, and that is to essentially arm you with the very basic fundamentals of what you will need in order to begin this journey. So I'll be talking about some fundamental concepts that are related to diversity and inclusion. So let's start with the obvious place, and that is diversity. What is diversity exactly? And it all sort of begins with diversity, but it definitely does not end with diversity. And diversity really just isn't very narrow as some people tend to think. It's not just about race, it's not just about black or white, and it's not just about men and women and just about gender either. It encompasses really a very large set of characteristics, human characteristics. In fact, I would say that anything that makes somebody unique, any part of somebody's identity that matters to them, is actually a factor in diversity. So this is a whole range of things. Right? This is certainly gender, certainly race, certainly ethnicity, but beyond that, things like sexual orientation, faith, nationality, age, disability, socioeconomic status, and many such things actually have to do with diversity. So we have to embrace and understand each of these things that make us different and unique, and in some cases, for some of us, are cause for us to have privilege or be subject to injustices, and we'll talk about more of that in just a moment. But we all have to begin to think about what is it that makes us different, and all of those elements count towards diversity and what means to be diversity. So we definitely need to expand our thinking of what diversity actually means, at least from the historical perspective of what it traditionally has meant for most people in the last 10 or 15 years. The flip side of diversity is inclusion, and we'll talk about the relationship between diversity and inclusion in a moment. Diversity on its own actually does not help that much. For example, you can take a look at my own country, the United States. We're certainly a diverse country. We're not lacking diversity. But we can definitely argue that we are lacking inclusion. So what is the distinction between diversity and inclusion? Diversity is having those differences and identifying those differences, but inclusion is making sure that those differences can thrive. It is intentionally creating an environment where diversity can not only exist but prosper, not only survive but thrive. And this is how we maximize the common good. And how do we do that? We do that not simply by making sure we are different, but also making sure we are different and those differences play to each other's strengths. So creating an environment that is fair, equitable, just, respectful, supportive, and empowering for all, not just for a few. That is really what inclusion means. Here's a graphic to explain it. So these are two different dimensions that you need to think about, both from a if you will, a company standpoint as well as an individual standpoint as well. So diversity is all of the things that make us different and valuable on our own right, and inclusion is making sure those differences flourish, right? That those differences do not cause us to be at each other's throats, but cause us to embrace each other and bring about the best in each other rather than the worst. So another couple of concepts that I will begin to explore, and this is very relevant in a modern understanding of diversity and inclusion, not an understanding that is based on maybe dynamics 20 or 30 or 50 years ago. So first, let's talk about discrimination. And I think most people understand what discrimination means. In fact, even very weakly governed states, autocratic states, have laws that deal with things like discrimination. Discrimination is mostly a legal term. So this is about prejudicial treatment, often intentional and on a consistent basis, geared towards a set of people based on usually legally protected status. So these are, in fact, things like race and gender and so on. Right? So if we just stop and only are concerning with ourselves with discrimination, then we are actually only solving a very small part of the problem. In fact, for most of us, discrimination is not something that we ought to be thinking about that much, right? When discrimination actually happens, it's already well beyond our hands, and things have already way too late, right? At this point, we're talking about things that have legal ramifications rather than societal ramifications and ramifications of inclusion. So discrimination is not where we begin to think about things, and not where we end it. In fact, where we really should begin the conversation is something called unconscious bias. And these are a very nuanced term that you really need to understand well in order to begin your diversity and inclusion journey. And this will go against, at least a little bit, some Western principles. And we'll talk about some more of those Western principles in a moment. But it's not about good people and bad people. It's recognizing the reality that we are ultimately only partly individuals responsible for ourselves. We are also a product of our environment, right? Be it that's the media or our upbringing or our social or historical context. We are a product of all of those things. So as a result, whether we realize it or not, we actually are almost hardwired with some set of biases. And these are basically stereotypes, prejudices, and preferences that cause us to ultimately advantage a set of people over another, right? And believe it or not, we all have these, and they are mostly unconscious. And this is actually the biggest part of the problem that we are dealing with today. If you look at the news, the things that you see in the news today actually don't have that much to do with discrimination. A lot of those tragic things are actually a result ultimately of unconscious bias. It is not evil people or a question of good or bad, but rather dealing with a concrete societal problem that we all have to one degree or the other. Now, in order to crystallize this, I will introduce a pretty advanced concept, and this is something called the pyramid of hate. It is something that is created by the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. There's a lot of things that I don't agree with the Anti-Defamation League with, but I think this is a very, very useful construct. And if you look here, basically, discrimination is something in the middle of that pyramid. It's certainly not anything to trivialize. It's very, very important. In fact, as you can see, there are higher up parts of the pyramid as well. In the case of ADL, obviously they're framing it towards genocide. But I would argue that things like slavery and colonization also, things that are essentially victimization and violence at a mass scale, those all belong at the top of the pyramid. So that does not happen in a vacuum. In order to get there, you need discrimination. And fundamentally, way before that, and something that is far more prevalent, is these acts of bias or unconscious stereotyping, rumors, non-inclusive language, insensitive remarks, jokes, inappropriate jokes, and so on and so forth. This is the foundation. And these are the things that are more relevant to us today. Right? These are the things that are causing obstacles for people that represent in those numbers that I talked about earlier, much more so than necessarily acts of discrimination. Right? So this is the things that we actually need to work on and root out the problem at its very root, so we can achieve another concept that we'll talk about in a moment, and that is equity. So let's talk about that concepts. And again, you will need to unlearn some of the things that you possibly have learned. So we'll start with this concept of equality. It sounds very wholesome. In fact, it is so pervasive in societies that there's laws, national constitutions that all were add this word equality in their mix, and it's hardwired into our brain to think that the only thing that matters is really this thing called equality. When in reality, just like discrimination, equality is actually not something that we ultimately care about. So equality, just for sake of definition, as I have included in the screen here, is basically the act of being truly equal, particularly with regards to access to resources and opportunities. And if you look at this definition, one thing that should stand out to you immediately is that this is a completely impractical concept. Right? This is merely a theoretical concept. It is an ideal. In fact, we may never achieve equality ever, right? No matter what we do, we can never actually be truly equal because, again, of the fact that we are not necessarily just individuals, but a product of our societies, a product of our upbringing, a product of many other variables that are outside of our control, but yet constitute the truth of what we all are. Okay, and this brings us to the concept of privilege, and this is an important concept, very important concept for us all to understand. Privilege is anything that is unearned advantage, right? Particularly geared towards a set of people, and we all have those particular intrinsic privileges that have not much to do with us as individuals, but what goes into making us as individuals. Right? So we all have privileges one way or the other. And what we need to understand is, and recognize is these privileges. But when we have these privileges, it will lead to a different problem that I'll explain in just a moment. But in order for us to overcome this concept of equality and its limitations, we need to think about a new concept that is more relevant to us today and something that will actually help us solve these problems in a real way. And that is equity. Okay, equity is a state of not of equality but of fairness. Okay, and equity often does not happen just automatically. You have to take intentional measures to remedy the impact of inequality, privileges, and injustice in order to reach a point where things are not as unjust and not as unequal. Here's a graphic that demonstrates it. Okay, so the reality of the world is that there is no such thing as equality. Nobody is really equal. Everybody has some built-in privileges, and there's always built-in injustices and inequalities built into the system. So simply treating everyone equally and pretending as though we have achieved equality does not solve anything. Ultimately, it causes the people that are not privileged to remain not privileged in the long term. And that's why we wind up with these persistent, systematic problems of oppression. So what we need to go towards is equity. Right? So giving people tools that they actually need in order to overcome an unfair and unjust situation and achieve ultimately justice and equity rather than equality. So again, I talked about the fact that if these were so simple, and if these large segments of the population that have to deal with issues of inequality, if they could solve these problems themselves, they would have solved it already. We're now well into a few millennia into human civilization. If these were self-solving problems, there was no reason for me to be delivering this talk today or have any fundamental reasons why I should have started this dialogue in the first place. So ultimately, what you need is something else. What you need is this concept now. So if you take away anything at all from this talk, I hope you take away this particular part of this talk and really understand how do we begin to solve these problems, and we solve these problems through allyship. Okay, so what is allyship in particular? Allyship is an informed action. You cannot be unconsciously or an ignorant ally. That doesn't happen. You need to educate yourself. You need to be intentional, and you need to be consistent. It can't be just, oh, I did my good deed for the century or good deed for my lifetime, I'm all good, I'm an ally. That's not the case. So it needs to be informed, intentional, and consistent, and be able to practice, empathize, and support others with the consistent objective of ultimately achieving greater fairness, justice, diversity, and inclusion. This is really what allyship means. And it is not simple. Okay, and it is not something you can do overnight either. Allyship is a journey, and all of us are in this allyship journey. It starts with a point of apathy, and frankly, this is where most people are at. Okay, they don't really have an understanding of diversity and inclusion issues and what the lived experiences of marginalized people are. Then you become aware, you understand the basic concepts, but you are not necessarily active, but at least you understand what's going on. Right? You've begun your journey into allyship. Then you become active, right? You seek out information, and you, when there's opportunities for you to do something, you go ahead and do it. So you are reactively an ally, if you will, for lack of a better term. And of course, ultimately, where you want to go is you want to be an advocate. You want to be somebody that proactively advances justice, advances equality, and advances all of the common good. And you do that without being prompted, without looking for opportunities. You seek out opportunities where you can advance diversity and inclusion. That is when you truly become an advocate and an ally and a champion. So a lot of people, when I try to have this conversation with them, the first thing they'll ask is, okay, this is all well and good and it all sounds very good, but what am I supposed to do about it? I'm just an individual, right? Is ALLYSHIP something I can do? I can't change anything. The reality is that is absolutely not true. ALLYSHIP, again, is a journey. And even a small step towards that journey is a step toward it nonetheless. And there's many different ways we can all be allies, no matter where we are, what level of privilege and power we have, and what our abilities are. So these are some of the ways that you can be an ally. So I'll list a few of them, and there's many such ways. One is something that hopefully you are doing right now, learning more about diversity and inclusion topics. Begin to be a part of the dialogue. If you see a particularly questionable incident that happened, that you observed, one thing to do is privately checking on the parties that were a part of that incident to understand what are they feeling. Making space for others to be heard. This is not a problem that I have, but many people do. Many people that are marginalized just have trouble being heard. So making a space where people can be heard, that's an important act of allyship. Listening and empathizing without jumping to conclusions when somebody feels or says they feel marginalized, because you ought to be listening at that point and trying to understand what are you actually missing. There may be something that you really don't understand yet. Lending your voice and support, if you have privilege, to support others when they need it, whether they're marginalized or whether they're allies. That is probably the most intrinsic part of the word of the meaning ally, is helping others when they need help. Respectively pointing out things like obviously discrimination but unconscious bias as well. When you see incidences of that, you can respectfully point it out that, hey, this is what is occurring. Authentic words of appreciation and acts of kindness. Mentoring and sponsoring others from a marginalized community. And finally, doing things like advancing diversity and inclusion initiatives at your company. Some of us are lucky enough so that our companies are already doing these sorts of things, but frankly, I know that there's many other companies that are simply not. So there's a lot of opportunities where you could be leading the diversity and inclusion initiatives in your company. There's just so much more to learn, right? So I've mentioned some of these things, and I'll leave you with some resources as well to think more about these topics and to do whatever it is that is in your power. But there's a lot more to learn, and there's an ocean of knowledge and a great journey that awaits you if you are interested in taking that journey, and I hope you are. So in summary, diversity and inclusion is a critical topic in technology, and it is important for all of us. I hope as a technologist I was able to make you aware of that and try to explain it to you in a simple way that makes sense. An essential first step that hopefully we've done today, or some of it today, is understanding the basics. And understanding the basics is very, very important and easy. It's not difficult. This is all common sense things that most intelligent people ought to understand if they give it a fair shot. And let this be only the beginning of your journey. There's many other things that you can do, and it should be a lifelong journey to make a real difference for other people and to make a real difference in all of our collective prosperity. So I'll finish up with some resources. This first one is from UC Denver. It's free. You can share it with whoever it is that you want. They don't have to pay anything in order to take advantage of those resources, and it'll talk more about some of the concepts that I talked about today. And also this particular slide deck is available on Speaker Deck open to you, all of you. You can reach out to me if there's a particular help that you need or a particular question that you have. I can try to help you or find somebody else that can. And finally, there's also an Udemy course that you can pay for, and many other books, many other good resources. You just need to begin looking as to where these resources are. There's no dearth of where you can learn more about these topics to educate yourself and become a good ally. So thank you very much. I really hoped this was helpful, and I hope that I was able to at least begin you on your diversity and inclusion journey. Anyway, I really appreciate it. I hope this was useful, and hopefully talk to you sometime in the future.